So we're going to switch gears a little bit. I wouldn't say a lot because site preparation, discussion topics, and veg management kind of go together. And we did get some little tasters for aspects of mentionings of 8-foot-tall sweet clover and timothy and other glorious species this morning. But we're going to dig into the weeds, so to speak, on this a little bit more this afternoon. And what I want to do to introduce the topic is introduce the topic. So the purpose of the next 20 to 25 minutes is really to get everyone all primed and excited about weed management and veg management issues. And then we're going to hear more from a range of other experts who've done both individual studies and just have general best practices to share with us. So my talk is not going to give you necessarily so many answers as much as just get everyone real riled and crazy about the rest of the afternoon. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Hopefully not falling asleep. That is not the goal. So the talk for the next 20 minutes is going to be deployment of vegetation with a purpose, use of desirable vegetation to control undesirable vegetation. I'm not sure if you should have the word vegetation in the same title 3 times, but anyway, I did it. Away we go. All right, so outline again. I'm going to do very similar to what I did this morning, where I kind of bring in a variety of different study examples. So you're not going to get a lot of background information on each of these projects, but I want to illustrate points with most of it. So that will be the method, and then there'll be a couple summary points, and then you'll be able to boot me off the stage here. All right, let's go back a little bit to forest reclamation research goal, or general goal. Maybe this should be a forest reclamation goal, but I need to turn this on. Oh, there we go. All right, oh, there we go. Okay, so one goal. I mean, we may have a variety of goals, but this is a goal I throw up on many of my slides because I think it reasonably captures what we're trying to get to in many cases. And that's really to develop techniques and approaches that will allow practitioners like yourselves to consistently reestablish functional and resilient forest plant communities. So a lot of what I do is really with that in mind. So I'm looking at vegetation or looking at issues of site preparation and weed management with the idea that we want to grow forest at the end of the day here. The forest may not look exactly like it did before, but it should be functional. We should have characteristics that indicate it's a functional system. And was mentioned earlier, things about looking at things like diversity. Having 80 species present on a reclamation site, this is a good thing, right? This is buffering you against change. So, conditions we would like to work with. These photos kind of are not a bad example. If I was an operational practitioner running around planting seedlings and trying to grow a forest, I would love it if I had starting conditions or early site conditions that look something like this, where you have growing space. There's some grasses, some native grasses coming in. Our planted seedlings are growing good, but they've got growing space in the future. There's maybe a few noxious weeds, but nothing out of control. That's the nice to have. This is what we aspire to. This is more often what we get. Who's walked through a patch of 6 to 8 feet sweet clover in their reclamation past? Yeah, okay. So you know what I'm talking about, and if anyone wants to know who's under the bug suit, that's Trevor Floriani sitting in the back there. We were doing veg surveys through here. It's unpleasant to say the least. And we think it's unpleasant to just walk through it. We have trees and shrubs and native species that are trying to grow through this. So these are real challenges and are detrimental. This is a white spruce trying to make its way through a patch of Alsite clover. And Alsite clover isn't a long-term problem, but it sure is real good at killing seedlings in the first couple of years when given the opportunity. This is a big balsam poplar, I think, trying to come through a patch of clover and Alsite clover, sweet clover and Alsite clover. This is difficult, so we need to recognize that these are issues and then find ways to manage them. So, what do we do in the face of our suboptimal reality? Suboptimal is a term I like to use. I used it a lot this summer. Maybe students didn't always appreciate it, but it's one way to say in the face of our junky reality, what can we do? Well, one potential answer, and there's other answers out there. This is not the only answer, but this is an answer that I think Dave alluded to earlier in his talk. And that was this idea of vegetation. Utilize vegetation to suit our reclamation and reforestation goals. Vegetation interactions are on these sites, they're present, and what we need to do is use species that are going to meet our goals and knock out these undesirable species. We can chase weeds around with a backpack sprayer or a broadcast sprayer, but if we don't have a plan to put in a desirable native vegetation community or some comparable vegetation community, we are going to continue to spray these weeds and spray these undesirable species for years and knock back the things we're trying to get into these sites. So when we do any type of intervention or weed management strategy, we always have to have a secondary re-veg goal in our minds, and utilizing vegetation is a big part of this. So the next few slides are really going to go to illustrate that a little bit more. And so this first study, this could have easily gone into the site preparation discussion this morning, but there's some real flavors of veg interactions that I wanted to illustrate with this. And this has applications to stockpile management, for example. So this study actually was designed originally to look at site preparation. This was a study supported by Bonavista, and Northwind Land Resources was the consultant out here. And we were initially looking at straight ripping and McNabb plowing. And when we got there, the consultant out there had told me, he said, yeah, I'm going to use all of these strippings. So this is a gas site that's been abandoned, and they're going to reclaim it. There's a topsoil pile and a subsoil pile hanging around. But he's a strong soil scientist or a soils person, and he thought there was all this nice organics developed over the last 20 odd years sitting on this well site. It's true, there is lots of organic matter through all those agronomic grasses. He was actually stripping this material before doing all of his other recontouring and reclamation work, and actually respreading it along with his topsoil as a secondary organic input, which had some good thoughts in there. But I was kind of horrified when he said it, because all I saw was creeping red fescue and Alside clover. I saw a future management problem. And so out of that discussion birthed the sod removal, sod placement study. So we had this other decompaction thing going on. The entire site was straight ripped or McNabb plow, but we won't go into that today. What I want to talk about is the impact of that sod placement on early revegetation success and woody establishment. So what you're looking at right now is a picture of the same site right after the rec work was done in the fall of 2013, I believe. And so this is the area with sod, and you can see like woody debris and lots of things that we think of as really good things for reclamation, and they kind of are. But we know what's in that bank. It's clovers, timothy, fescue, and then this is the area that was had no sod placed, just normal topsoil and subsoil. And these are my dogs, in case you guys were sure. They're not wolves or coyotes. Okay, so just a couple of photos to get us primed in terms of what we're going to look at in terms of data. This is the first year, so this is what a quadrat, we have a 1/2 meter by 1/2 meter quadrat for measuring veg cover, and this is what it looked like. There is a quadrat boundary in there. When we had the sod placed, this is what it looks like without the sod placed. We have the same composition, but at lower volumes, largely. This is what it looked like in terms of woody densities after 2 growing seasons. So, total woody density after 2 years, and this is on 6 study sites, where we placed the sod. We're averaging overall about, 1,800 stems per hectare, and we're averaging around 4,000 stems per hectare with the sod removed. These are 95% confidence intervals. These are all statistically significant results. And this big difference is driven largely by the shrubs. So the scale is different here. This is 6,000, 2,000, 6,000. So the shrub density is actually the big driver of this difference, though the planted trees, and the trees planted here were white spruce and lodgepole pine, were definitely on the whole surviving better where we removed the sod. We can look a little closely, because obviously it's not the sod itself, it's the vegetation that's coming out of the sod that's driving this difference. So I've broken this out into some vegetation categories. And so again, sod present is in green, and then sod removed is in blue. And you can look at lots more grass cover. So this is non-native grasses, native grasses. I've separated them out because we had a lot of both. And then native forbs, non-native forbs. Total cover was the same. Overall, so after 2 years, even though initially there was some cover differences, the 2-year annual or average veg cover was actually very much the same. But it was driven by a trade-off in forb development, right? So higher forb development here in the no sod, and higher grass development where the sod was present. And a lot of native forb development, it actually outpaced the non-native forb development. Another way to look at the kind of the same thing is to dump this all into an ordination and then look at the species community changes. So we are not species, but these vegetation groups. So non-native grasses are clustering over here. Native grasses, high native grass covers clustering over here. Non-native forbs and native forbs are kind of going in the same direction, and our total shrub and total tree densities are going in this direction with our forbs, both forbs, native and non-native. This was a little bit counterintuitive for me because I often think of our non-native forbs and our clovers as being pretty problematic. In this particular study, it was actually the agronomic grasses. So that you see the native grasses are kind of over here. They're not directly related to that higher or lower tree density. It's these non-native grasses that are actually driving it, and Dave illustrated that point really well with the 40-year-old slope that was still filled with grasses. These species are very good at what they do, but they're also very good at precluding development of others. Okay, study 2. So this is actually a density trial. It's a large-scale density trial. It's on a facility, an in-situ facility stockpile. It's about 8 hectares in size. And in this study, we're actually evaluating establishment density. So we're planting this site, either not planting it, 2,500 stems per hectare, 5,000 stems or 10,000 stems of this dog's breakfast of species. So there's a number of species here, and the idea here was, again, to look at those minimum thresholds. First, if we do a good job of site preparation, and we did do a good job of site preparation on this site, it was a big smooth slope, hydroseeded with native grasses and clovers twice, and growing not much of anything else, but what we came in and did, oh, can I show a picture? No, I didn't, okay. I thought I had a picture here, but maybe I don't. So this study, actually, before we planted these trees in 2016, we corner bladed. So Chris mentioned in his slide before lunch, corner blading. So that's taking a D6 with a 6-way blade, dipping it into the ground and creating furrows. So this entire site was furrowed that way to create heterogeneity and also to displace the existing bank of grasses and clovers. And then also woody material placed in different portions of the site where we had it available. And so the vegetation data we're looking at right here is 2 years. This data is pretty raw. I compiled it this weekend, and so I haven't run any formal statistics on it. What I did was take all of our veg quadrat data, and we had about 850 quadrats, so 850 individual half-meter by half-meter quadrats taken over this study, over all the different densities. And what I've done is calculated averages and then expressed a standard error based on an n equals 6. Although it's hundreds of quadrat measurements, our actual replicate level at the block is 6 reps. So this is a very, very simple way and very preliminary way of looking at our 2-year vegetation results. But what we see here is really interesting, and some of it actually surprised me, but surprised in a good way. So again, total cover, really not different between the treatments. It's a little lower, maybe on average, in the 10,000 stems per hectare. Arguably, this wouldn't be statistically different. Grass cover, similar. Native forb cover, similar. We're seeing already a trending upward in woody density cover after 2 years. That's cool, that's good. So 10,000 stems per hectare is apparently impactful after 2 growing seasons, at least in that site. And non-native forb cover is showing a really interesting trend, downward. So at 10,000 stems per hectare, we're seeing this downward shift in non-native forb cover. That non-native forb cover is predominantly Alsite clover, red clover, and sweet clover. That's 80% of the non-native forb development on this site. There's a little bit, there is some scentless chamomile and some sow thistle and some other things, but this is primarily what we're looking at is a reduction in clover development after 2 years. Do you remember that point I made earlier about the root development in the shrubs? and how large those, how big of a root development we were seeing in western dogwood. We have 2 shrub species, early successional shrub species planted on this site, green alder and pussy willow. And these species are doing really well on this site. They're large. The green alder is already this big. That species is invariably impacting stuff around it, and I wonder if it's actually driving these down. So as a veg management tool, or thinking about vegetation interactions overall, I think we shouldn't discount the impact of our woody species and how we plant them or how we establish them. Now, planting 10,000 stems per hectare is not all that cheap. So that kind of led me to thinking about how can we achieve high density benefits, the benefits of high density planting, without planting 10 or 20,000 stems per hectare. And that led to the evolution of a concept I call cluster planting. And this project work is actually being done in collaboration with the gentleman sitting in the room here. His name's Dr. Brad Pino. You'll hear about him later today. And Dr. Simon Landhauser at the U of A. So we put our 3 collective noodles together and started thinking a little bit more about how we get some of those benefits without the additional costs. And that led us to this project, and what we're going to look at is just some photos and some early results from 2 different cluster plant studies. This first one is a pilot study. So we piloted this concept in the same year we planted the density trials. This was from 2016, and what we did was, at a very small scale, planted groups of aspen. So we either planted aspen singly. The effective density at the plot scale was 2,500 stems per hectare of aspen, but we then either planted them in groups of no groups, so just normal uniform spacing, ends up being about 2.5 meters, or groups of 4, groups of 10, or groups of 20. The spacing between trees is about 25 centimeters, so it's very tight. Many of these trees won't get to merchantable volumes, they'll die, but that's okay. They're going to help develop at a smaller scale some interesting vegetation dynamics, I hope. And what we're looking at here is, I think, a group of 10, and then in between all this clover, these photos were taken this year, so at the height of our clover epidemic, and you can see all this aspen actually coming through in and around the clover. Oh, I've had even some circles there, and you can see this. What's neat to see is actually visually, where you see these clusters of aspen, you actually see sweet clover around it, but not in it. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And this is just an example of what the singly planted aspen looked like. There he is. That's the actual. This is a zoomed in image. But this is the sow thistle. I've never seen sow thistle get so big. This stuff is about 6 feet tall. And this is the poor little aspen trying to come through all this sow thistle. And you can see it's, he's still there, but he's kind of struggling. I'm not sure he's going to be a merchantable tree. I didn't get a chance to compile the second year vegetation data, but this is a look at what it looked like in terms of veg development last year. And what we see is very much the same trend of what I saw in the density trial. But this, of course, this is at a different spatial scale. This is looking in and around the cluster of trees. And what we see is that, lo and behold, if you plant more aspen trees together, you're going to get higher cover. That's not stunning. Overall cover is comparable, but forb cover, and in this initial assessment, we had actually grouped the forb cover together. I hadn't intended on measuring this in the first year, because I didn't think there'd be anything to measure, but I saw when we were doing our operational work that there was something funny going on visually, so I wanted to quantify it. So we did it really quick in the sense of vegetation categories. But what we can see in terms of total forb cover is this steady decline. As we get into the larger clusters, we're actually seeing less total forb development. And that, I think, is playing into why you see this sweet clover around these clusters of trees, that they never got started in their first year. And just this is just one slide, another visual photo of a trial that was just started this year. And this is taking that cluster plant idea out a little bit larger. So how would you operationalize a cluster plant concept? Maybe you would actually want to cluster these trees in a more organized way and in larger groups. Instead of these little tight 10 trees, 20 trees, maybe you want to do clusters that are 3 by 3 meters in size or 7 by 7 meters in size, and have real deciduous patches, maybe with white spruce or something intermixed all in between, but have these discrete patches of trees. And this trial will continue to look at that over time, and we're hoping to see some comparable results there. Last point. Again, with this is a more localized way of looking at veg management because we're planting trees and we care about what's happening to that tree. We want to see that tree go from a little tree to a big tree. So how can we manage conditions around that tree to ensure its establishment and growth? Many of the weeds we're talking about in the problem species, I would say on the herbaceous side or on the clover side more than on the grass side. Grasses are a bit of a different mix. Are short-term effects, but they're meaningful short-term effects. So how can we maybe create conditions that are better locally for the trees we plant, but not necessarily intervene on the entire site? And this is kind of where I started thinking about planting a bouncer around our seedlings. So in this trial, there's a couple trials now, we've actually co-grown a native herbaceous species with a tree species. And then we outplant them and then we watch them grow. So we've looked at using aster, which is illustrated here. These sites, this is 3 years old. The aster you can see growing around it, varying quantities. And this is fireweed growing. So this was a white spruce with fireweed. This is actually a willow with a fireweed. These are first year. And this is paper birch with a fireweed growing around it. And again, the idea here is create conditions, if we think that these native forbs are not going to have a detrimental impact on our trees, maybe they can create a little buffer of happiness around that tree that allows that tree to survive or maybe persist through clover epidemics kind of around it. But if that vegetation is established right away and it egresses roots right away, it owns that space. That is the idea there, right? Is that these species will own that space and they'll block out the other guys coming in around them. But this work is all fairly early stages. So far it looks promising. Now, willow and fireweed is maybe not going to be the mix to take home, but certainly we're seeing good results from white spruce mixed with other forbs. Okay, in summary, I'm almost done. I know this is a tough one after lunch. From the first study we looked at, know your reclamation materials. When stripping soils for reclamation, this not only applies to just the stuff sitting on the site. This guy was using the sod that was kind of sitting on the well site, but this even applies to our topsoil piles and subsoil piles. They're usually not there. They have a vegetation community and sometimes often undesirable. We may want to change the way we strip these soils in order to reduce some of our weed management issues. When thinking about the pros and cons of grasses, we have to think about the species. Grasses in themselves are not wholly bad, and they do a job for us in a veg management perspective for certain weeds, but we need to consider the species. Higher density planting, whether you do it at the operational scale or at a more localized scale, may be an effective means of establishing desirable woody species and may even have local effects on undesirable species. And then utilization of other native herbaceous plants, non-grasses, is another alternative to think about. So maybe go out and try it. And with that, acknowledge a whole pile of folks. Poor Trevor again. These were a couple of our students that were kind of sopping wet. He forgot his rain pants, and I don't think he ever forgot again. And all the funders and industry folks and staff and our collaborators. There's been many that I talked about in these projects today. I'll take any questions.